Vajrasana, lightning bolt pose. Jane begins in a high kneeling position with her feet and knees together, then sits back. As we look at her pose, we can see she shifted her hips to the right, shortening her left side. It looks as if she's sitting toward her sacrum, causing her back to bow and collapse her chest. Jane has placed the toes of her right foot on top of those on her left, and her ankles have separated, putting a slight twist in her knees. She's clasped her hands and placed them on her right thigh, throwing her head and shoulders off center. Let's have Jane come back to a high kneeling position and try again. This time, as she sits back, Jane works to keep her knees and ankles together and her hips level. She brings her pelvis upright to sit toward the front of her sits bone as she rests her hands on her thighs. To complete the pose, Jane lifts her hips slightly and tucks her toes under. She then sits back on her heels as she lifts her torso. To exit, Jane lifts her hips, crosses her ankles, and sits back. She then extends her legs in Dandasana. Let's watch Jane's skeleton in Vajrasana. As we look at her initial pose, we can see how her hips are uneven, her right toes are resting on her left toes, and her heels are separated. One side is shorter than the other. Her back is bowed out, her chest is collapsed, and her head is thrust forward. She doesn't look comfortable. Let's have Jane come back to a high kneeling position and try again. This time Jane works to keep her feet and knees together as she sits back. She keeps her hips level as she rests her hands on her thighs and lifts her torso. To finish the pose, Jane lifts her hips and turns her toes under. She lifts her torso as she sits back on her heels. To exit Vajrasana, Jane lifts her hips, crosses her ankles, and sits back. She then extends her legs in Dandasana.